There is no clearer example of this, of the US being a rogue state, than the vote every single year in the United Nations General Assembly, in which almost every single country on earth votes to condemn the illegal 6-decade-long US blockade of Cuba. This is a suffocating, illegal blockade that has starved Cuba of hundreds of billions of dollars, that has tangibly led to deaths and civilian suffering and hunger in Cuba. This is a form of economic warfare, economic terrorism that the United States has carried out against Cuba for over 60 years. And every single year at the United Nations, almost every single country on earth votes to condemn this illegal blockade. This year, 2022, is no exception. On November 3rd, 185 countries at the United Nations, out of the 193 member states, voted to condemn the illegal US blockade of Cuba. Only 2 countries voted to defend this illegal blockade: the United States itself and apartheid Israel, which is an extension of US imperialism. It's a Western colonial outpost in West Asia, an extremely geostrategic region with important natural resources and hydrocarbons. This table showing all of the countries in the world voting is absolutely incredible. It shows that the United States and its colonial extension, Israel, are the world's leading rogue regimes. No other country on earth comes even close to violating international law as much as they do. 185 out of the 193 nations, that means 96% of the countries on earth voted to condemn this illegal US blockade of Cuba. Now, there were 2 abstentions. Brazil, which is currently governed by the far-right Jair Bolsonaro administration, although that's going to be ending very soon, as in January we see that the new president-elect, Lula da Silva, the former left-wing president, is going to come back. So that means that there's going to be probably 1 abstention after, and that's the NATO proxy regime in Ukraine. I want to repeat that. 185 countries voted against the illegal US blockade of Cuba. 2 countries voted to support the blockade, the US and Israel, and just 2 countries abstained: Ukraine and Brazil. So that says a lot about, one, why NATO has turned, why it's fighting so hard to keep Ukraine into this puppet regime, which Ukraine has been since 2014, when the US government backed a violent coup that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected government and installed a pro-Western puppet regime. And that's also why the US installed Bolsonaro, the fascist leader of Brazil, after 2 US-backed coups, one in 2016, a political coup that removed the left-wing Workers' Party government and President Dilma Rousseff, and 2018, a US-backed coup in which Lula da Silva was imprisoned on fake, bogus charges that have been completely expunged. And that was what prevented Lula from participating in the election he was going to win, according to all the polls, and that's what handed power to Bolsonaro. Now, this vote is not new at all. This has been going on for 30 years. Every single year for 30 years, almost every country on earth votes against the illegal US blockade of Cuba. Even the US's allies. It's basically its puppets in Europe who, I mean, maybe they have a little sovereignty because they're at least willing to vote against the US at the UN in this case. So even if you look at the EU member states, even if you look at the special relationship between the US and Britain, even Britain votes to condemn the illegal US blockade. Even Canada. Here is the United Nations news report from 2021 in June, when it's titled, UN General Assembly calls for US to end Cuba embargo for 29th consecutive year. And the vote was almost exactly the same. It was 184 voting to oppose the US blockade, 2 to support the blockade, and 3 abstentions. The only difference last year was Colombia. And now Colombia has its first ever left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, and he voted against the US blockade. Whereas in the past, Colombia had been dominated by right-wing US puppet regimes that voted to support the US blockade. For people who are more interested, I actually just did a report, a video and a podcast talking about the historic trip that Colombia's new left-wing president Petro took to Venezuela. But the point is that this is not new at all. This has been going on for decades. And the US blockade of Cuba itself goes back at least until 1962 on paper. That is when the US government officially declared the embargo of Cuba. But in reality, the US began imposing illegal unilateral sanctions and starting this economic war on Cuba right after the victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, after the Cuban people overthrew a US-backed puppet, a brutal right-wing dictator, Fulgencio Batista, who was propped up by the US as he murdered his people, as he tortured leftists, as he stole billions of dollars through corruption and worked with mafias and the CIA. His brutal dictatorship was propped up by the US, and it was overthrown in a popular revolution in 1959. And the US empire has been punishing brutally the people of Cuba ever since. Now, why has the US government been imposing this illegal blockade for over 60 years? Well, if you go to the US government's own Office of the Historian from the State Department, you can find a memo that was written by the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs in 1960, and it exposes the US goal with the blockade and the sanctions is to make the Cuban people suffer so much, to punish them collectively so much, so that they overthrow their government. The U.S. said its explicit goal with the blockade is to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. This is the document from the official U.S. government website. And it admits in 1960 that the majority of Cubans supported Fidel Castro. There was no effective political opposition. And then they also say that the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So the US government admitted the majority of the Cuban people supported the socialist revolutionary government in Cuba. They supported Castro, and the only way the US could destabilize the government is by creating disenchantment, disaffection, economic dissatisfaction, and hardship. That is to make the Cuban people suffer, to make them bleed. That has been the U.S. goal for over 60 years. The U.S. government wrote, every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. That's the U.S. goal, to weaken the economic life of Cuba. Every possible means, including terrorism, including war. And they say that the U.S. government must do everything it can to make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. I repeat, this is the official document, the memo from the U.S. State Department, admitting the U.S. goal is terrorism. It's to make the Cuban people suffer, to deny them money and supplies, to deny them medicine, to deny them food, to decrease their wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. So this explains the U.S. goal behind the illegal blockade that has gone on since the 1960s, and that every single country on earth basically opposes. Now, I want to answer briefly a question that several people have asked me because it's confusing to people. If you look at the UN General Assembly vote against the U.S. blockade, you see, again, 185 in favor, 2 against, 2 abstentions, and you see that 4 countries didn't vote. Liberia, Moldova, Somalia, and surprisingly, Venezuela. People were asking me, wait a second, why didn't Venezuela vote to condemn the U.S. blockade? Well, I've spoken to Venezuelan experts. I had a conversation with them, with a few people today, journalists and diplomatic experts, and they explained that, of course, they would have voted in a heartbeat. In fact, Venezuela was encouraging people around the world to vote for this resolution condemning the U.S. blockade. Why didn't they vote? Because Venezuela couldn't vote. And why couldn't it vote? Because of the U.S. blockade against Venezuela. That is the extreme irony, and it shows the horrible criminality of the U.S. rogue regime. Venezuela was not able to vote against the illegal U.S. blockade of Cuba because it itself is under a U.S. blockade, and another illegal criminal U.S. blockade that has killed thousands of Venezuelans. Now, in order to explain this, we should look at a media report. This is a Spanish language article in a French media outlet, a French state propaganda outlet called RFI, and it's in Spanish. It's from January of this year. So I'm just going to briefly translate some of the main points. It says Venezuela is among the 8 countries that lose the right to vote at the UN because of a lack of payment. It notes that countries including Venezuela, Iran, and Sudan lost the right to vote at the UN because of excessive debt with the organization. Now, what unifies Venezuela, Iran, and Sudan? All 3 of these countries are under brutal blockades, sanctions by the US. Economic warfare that locks them out of the US-dominated international financial system. And the United Nations itself is extremely biased against these countries. It's one of the only international organizations where these countries actually do have a voice and representation, but it's also biased in favor of US imperialism in the West. As an example, of course, the UN is physically based in New York City, in the United States itself, and the U.S. government constantly violates the host agreement that it signed. And the U.S. is supposed to provide diplomats and representatives from governments of all 193 member states. The U.S. is supposed to give them the right, visas, to enter, to speak at the United Nations, and the U.S. routinely denies them.